Hello, everyone. Welcome from Greenacre. Greenacre is a Baha'i Center of Learning. And my name is Jessica Gaines. I serve as program coordinator here. And we're very happy to have all of you here, and especially to have Dr. Layli Maparyan with us this evening. We're very grateful to her for taking the time and the energy to be with us. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a brief intro to Greenacre and what we're up to, and to Dr. Maparyan, and then I'm going to hand it over to her because that's why you're here. So normally we'd be having this program in person on Greenacre's beautiful campus, which is on the banks of the Piscataqua River here in quaint Elliott, Maine, which is the homeland of the Wabanaki people. However, COVID has kept us apart this year, and yet at the same time, it's opened the door for more of us to be together in this virtual space. And for that, we're actually quite grateful. Greenacre we've been able to expand and reach many more people than we normally would. So Greenacre's been hosting and creating spaces for the investigation of spiritual and social reality since the late 1800s, when it began to gather people from all over the world, people with extremely different views and perspectives. The administrator of Greenacre kind of likes to say that it was like we were hosting the TED Talks of the day. And I think he's kind of spot on with that. So today we continue the focus on exploring and addressing the important issues of the day, most especially social justice and race unity, and creating spaces and conditions that are conducive to elevated conversations. We often utilize art for this purpose, especially now that we're operating pretty much 100% virtually. And each art show has a theme, of course, and we like to create discourse spaces of exploration associated with each art show. And this space tonight is associated with our upcoming art show, which is called, we're entitling it Just Diverse United, the Destiny of America. And so, of course, Dr. Maparyan's talk is, I think, right in line with that. If you would actually like to submit a piece of art or pieces of art for our upcoming show, any medium, visual, music, poetry, dance. Now that we're online, we can do anything. Please visit the page greenacre.news and go to events and go to artist call. And I will actually put that in the chat here in a second. So the deadline for submissions, unfortunately, is coming up is June 29th, but if you have something to share, we would love to have it. So a little bit of tech real quick. This evening's program will run for approximately 90 minutes. The last 30 minutes or so will be reserved for Q&A. So as you can see, we're in a webinar because we had over 175 people register for this evening. So that means you won't be able to see or hear each other. Of course, you'll be able to see and hear us, but we encourage you to communicate with everyone or even just us through the chat option. If you take your cursor and move it and hover it towards the bottom of your screen, you'll see some icons pop up. One of them is chat. If you click that button, you'll be able to chat away to all of us. We love to hear your thoughts, actually. It makes us feel like we're more connected with you. So if you want to share ideas, just emotions that are evoked in you, please do that through that chat icon. However, if you have a question or a comment that you would like Dr. Maparyan to address, please put it in the Q&A chat because it will get lost. The Q&A box, it will get lost in the chat box. So the Q&A is same, bottom of your screen. You can click on that icon, go ahead and put that in there, and I will then relay those questions to Dr. Maparyan when the time is right. So now I'm happy to introduce our presenter this evening, Dr. Layli Maparyan. Ph.D. is Executive Director of the Wellesley Center for Women, a women and gender-focused research and action institute at Wellesley College, where she's also professor and chair of the Africana Studies Department. She's best known for her scholarship in the area of womanism and is the author of 2 groundbreaking texts in the field of womanist studies, The Womanist Reader and The Womanist Idea. A 3rd book is forthcoming. Dr. Maparyan has also published significantly in the areas of adolescent development, social identities, Black LGBTQ studies, hip-hop studies, and history of psychology. Dr. Maparyan's scholar activist work interweaves threads around a common theme of integrating identities and communities in peaceable, ecologically sound, and self-actualizing ways. And we were really lucky to have her with us a few months ago as well. And we recorded that, and you can find that program on our website. I'll also put that in the chat so you can watch that for free as well. And with that, I'll pass it over to Dr. Maparyan.
Thank you, Jessica. It's my pleasure to be here. I really appreciate you inviting me and actually giving me a great opportunity because, as you mentioned, I've presented at and for Greenacre a number of times before, and I've frequently mentioned the invitational perspective, but generally speaking, it wasn't something that I elaborated on. So I appreciate you inviting me back to elaborate on it. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. The title of this presentation is an invitational framework for social transformation. And this particular framework is something that I began talking about within the context of womanism, but eventually it sort of got a life of its own. And tonight is the first time I'm actually focusing exclusively on that. So I'm very excited about that. So let's begin. Is there another way to move towards that better world that we all know is possible? That's the question that's really animated my thinking about social change methodology and about the different kinds of ways that we can move in the social change space. I like to think of the world as being comprised of different energies. On the one hand, we can see in the world, and we often feel so heavily, this conflict, this kind of hate that seems to be cropping up. We feel surrounded by illness and disease and people suffering under economic insecurity. We see violence all over the world. We see ecological destruction. These are the global scale problems that we are always thinking about. But at the same time, if we tune in, we can also find spaces in the world of peace, love, health and vitality, prosperity, care and kindness, and ecological restoration. It's important to acknowledge that both of these things exist simultaneously, and to some extent, we both choose which ones to gravitate towards, and we also choose which ones to reproduce and recreate in the world. So to a large extent, we are the creator of the energies in the world. In this era of extreme polarization between all kinds of people, it often feels like we're just recycling hostilities and not really making progress towards social justice or greater human well-being. Yet, a simple frame shift from opposition to invitation opens up new vistas and presents new solutions. So I want to begin just by getting us to do a comparison and contrast. I want to introduce the invitational perspective, but I want to introduce it by showing it as it's distinct from another type of perspective or another approach. What I call the politics of opposition can be witnessed in things like this, talking about us versus them. All of those times we talk about the struggle or the battle against something, when we invoke bellicose metaphors to talk about making change, when we talk about winning and losing, when we talk about victors and people being vanquished, when we say things like, if you're not for us, you're against us, or if you're not with us, you're against us, all of those reflect a kind of oppositional perspective, one in which you divide people into camps and you assume that one is good, one is bad, one is right, one is wrong, one is good, one is evil, etc. You may assume a hierarchy or something, but it's a very distinct kind of position, and we see a lot of that in the world today. In fact, people often describe one of the worst problems right now as the extreme polarization in the political sphere or in other sectors of society. But we can contrast the politics of invitation with that. The politics of invitation is just like it sounds. It's inviting people to a circle of unity. It uses terms like we, or all of us, or family. It makes statements like, we invite you to join us, or let's move together. It also has this sort of attitude of, let's start wherever you are. It's not that people have to be a certain place before they can be acceptable. Anyone can show up and begin moving forward. It's a build it and they will come kind of idea, the idea that we can envision a better world. We can begin building that world from right where we are, that we don't have to wait for anything other than ourselves to get it started. It's sort of that we are the ones that we've been waiting for kind of mentality. So Having said that, I want to illuminate a paradox that I've really had my eye on for most of my adult life. And that is the paradox between the oppositional methodologies that we often invoke and use in an attempt to get us to a peaceful world. You know, I used to live in Atlanta, and there's a place in Atlanta where it's famous for the political graffiti. And I used to drive by it every day on the way to work. And one day, I can't even remember what movement was going. I guess it was Occupy Atlanta was going on. I drove by and I saw this and I thought, what a perfect depiction of the paradox. We've got the icon of the fist, which is a symbol of fighting, a symbol of power, at the same time as we have it next to an idea about pursuing a peaceful world. And so it made me think about the means ends problem, which is the problem when our means towards something are not aligned with our ends. Can we actually get to peace in an oppositional way? Can we actually get to a unified world in a way that divides people? Those are the kind of questions that I began thinking about on an ongoing basis. And what came to me, particularly in my research on womanism, was that there is another approach, and that is what I began to call the invitational approach. The invitational approach is an idea of bringing people together into circles of inclusion by inviting them to join and by enacting that better world now, by begin to behave as though we're already there and inviting people to come build that together. This is an image of people who are actually engaged in a Baha'i study circle, which is one form of an invitational space in which people are invited to come together to think about different ways to engage life, to think about the meaning of life, to think about how and why we exist, and to think together about those things. Another image that I love that sort of just gives a visual feeling of the invitational perspective is this picture of a neighborhood block party. It reminds me of a statement that once came to me in a dream. It was a dream about womanism, in which I said womanism is like a neighborhood with everybody coming together for a common purpose. It very much embodies the invitational perspective. It's this notion that people are coming together from wherever they may find themselves, all different kinds of people. The people aren't all the same, but they're arriving for a common purpose. And that common purpose is their well-being, the well-being of their community. It's taking care of themselves and taking care of others at the same time. I also wanted to show the Ruhi Institute logo. A few slides ago, when I showed the people in the study circle, they were studying books that are part of the Ruhi Institute, which is a grassroots education and community development program within the Baha'i faith. And the logo for it clearly depicts the invitational perspective. It's a diverse group of people who are diverse in age, in gender, in nationality, in background, perhaps even in language, being open to including one more person, always being open to one more person. So this, as you can see, is getting us to sort of the heart of the invitational perspective. So when we think about this, what does the invitational perspective help us with? Some questions that we are concerned about in the world today, and particularly in the social change sector, are things like, how do we build bridges with people who are different? Because obviously difference is one of those things that causes the polarization that we're experiencing today, or that people associate with it. How do we make common cause with our so-called enemies? Within the invitational perspective, we might not call anyone an enemy, but we know that in the oppositional sphere, enemies is one of the ways that we think about people. How do we make common cause if we do, in fact, need to come together as one? Also, how do we move forward despite conflict or differing opinions? Even when you're connected to somebody, you can have conflicts. Differing opinions occur. How do we move forward and not let those lock us down into opposition or polarization? How do we work with people of different capacities or temperaments? There's a tendency in, at least in the American society, I imagine other places as well, for people who are similar, for example, in terms of educational level or personality or whatever, to cluster together without even feeling the need necessarily to get out of their bubble to include others. But when we think deeply about people's different capacities and temperaments and the need for us to come together even across those lines, that too is important. How do we work through fear or our dislike of difference? Because it's true that some differences don't bother us, but other ones do. And some of them even threaten our lives. So how do we work through the different kinds of differences that exist in the world? How do we overcome anxiety about taking initiative? How do we keep a tenuous connection so that it gets stronger? A lot of times when we're doing this work, we start with very fragile connections that can easily fall apart. And if we don't have a methodology for strengthening them, then we lose the ground that we've gained. And last but not least, how do we make social change authentic and sustainable? How do we make it something that's real and something that lasts? Because there have been so many social change efforts over time, but those particular efforts have sometimes changed over time. They've been subject to backlash. They've fallen apart when conditions change, et cetera. So we're concerned with social change that's both authentic and sustainable. All right, so what does an invitational perspective require? I'm going to break it down into 4 areas. One is a particular view of human nature. A second thing is a particular view of human relationships. A third thing is a particular view of society. And a fourth thing is a view of the nature and purpose of life. Now, those are obviously very high level areas of thought, but these are actually where the shifts are needed, because this thought feeling matrix about human beings and about society and about life is where the way things are is generated. The world we live in is generated because we have a particular view of human nature. It's because we have a particular view about human relationships, a particular view of society, and a particular view of the nature and purpose of life. And those views collectively are holding the politics of opposition in place. If we want to move to a more invitational kind of approach and framework, then we need to rethink each of these areas. So I'm going to talk about each of them in turn. First, human nature. I want to advance the following propositions. First, that human beings are fundamentally noble. Second, that the basis of human identity is spiritual, not material. Third, that human beings are not just individuals, but human beings are also a collective. We're very accustomed to thinking of ourselves as just each of ourselves individually, but in order to fully embrace the invitational perspective, you have to have a way of thinking about all human beings together as a collective organism. So I'm going to be pulling from the writings of Baha'u'llah and other figures from the Baha'i faith throughout this presentation, and this is the first of those quotes. Baha'u'llah says, "O son of spirit, noble have I created thee, yet thou hast abased thyself. Rise then unto that for which thou wast created." This cements the idea that nobility is fundamental to the Baha'i view of human nature, and I argue that it is also fundamental to the invitational framework. Baha'u'llah also says, "O friends, be not careless of the virtues with which ye have been endowed, neither be neglectful of your high destiny." Now, this quote reflects a very high view of human nature. It reflects an understanding that human beings are not just another kind of animal, but rather human beings are invested with spirit, and as beings invested with spirit and spirit that reflects the attributes of God, that we do indeed have great virtues and great endowments and a high destiny. And it's up to us to help guide all humanity to reflect those virtues and those endowments and that high destiny. So I talk about in one of my books how this idea of human nobility and the spiritual nature of humankind leads us to be able to think about the sacredness of human beings, but not just the sacredness of human beings. In fact, the sacredness of everyone and all creation. So I talk about the 3 recognitions. The first is to recognize your own sacredness. We have things all around us telling us that we're not sacred, telling us that we're evil and vile and bad and degraded. And, we get these messages all the time, every day. And some in certain groups get these messages more than others. But recognizing our own sacredness is an antidote to that. It is a recognition that our true identity is spiritual and noble. But at the same time as we recognize that in ourselves, no matter who we are and what group we belong to, we also recognize that that is an attribute of all human beings and that it is in fact an attribute of all creation. When we recognize this and then we act accordingly, we treat people and creation with reverence. We have feelings of awe and love. Feelings of reverence, awe, and love evoke different behaviors in terms of how we act with each other and how we act with the rest of creation. So it's an instant, accessible social change method just to recognize our own and other sacredness and the sacredness of all creation. Yet, this method is harder than we think. It's instant, it's easy, it's accessible, but we are also socialized to think in such grave polarities all the time. Now, I'm about to put everybody through an exercise, and I want to warn you that this exercise can be challenging and maybe even triggering, but to me, it's like the only way I can really make the point that I want to make. All right, so here's one view, good, bad. We're looking at the conflicts in society, particularly when we're thinking about racial justice. Everybody remembers what happened when Trayvon Martin was shot by George Zimmerman. And immediately it triggered us to be polarizing, to think some people in society thought one of these people is good and the other one is bad. Other people thought one of these people is bad, another of these people is good. And that created a war within society, two different views in opposition to each other. But the invitational view would take a completely different perspective. And I know it's challenging, but it's one that we have to deeply consider and think about. And that is that every single person is sacred. Just because somebody violates what we think are the virtues of human beings and violates human nobility, we have to remember that we are all connected, and that the way that we think about a person who has engaged in what we consider to be wrongdoing has to reflect keeping that person in the fold, inside of understanding that we're all family and that we have to deal with each other. And this is not to excuse certain behaviors, but it is to make us think more deeply about our interconnectedness and never let it go. So let's try this exercise again in a more contemporary way that I'm sure a lot of people will be able to relate to. Let's take our presidential candidates. In some people's view, one of these candidates is good and the other one is bad. In some people's view, the other candidate is bad, the other candidate is good. But in the view that I'm trying to advance tonight, we need to recognize that both individuals are sacred, that they were born noble, that that nobility is the birthright of all. And we have to ask ourselves, if we believe that someone isn't living up to their virtues and their endowments and their ultimate nobility, how did that happen? Why did that happen? How did things go off the rails? What do we collectively need to do about it? So how did you do in this exercise? Just pause for a moment and notice how it felt to think about good, bad, bad, good, sacred, sacred, and imagine thinking about it with regard to anyone that you feel extreme discomfort with, anyone that you may have thought is opposed to you, or anyone who you don't understand. All right. The helpful tip here is that oppositional thinking is polarizing. So if we don't want polarity in the world, we have to stop having oppositional thinking. Invitational thinking, on the other hand, is unifying. If we want unity, we have to figure out how to have invitational thinking. Of course, there are accountability questions, and I want to address those because we have to be able, even within this frame of radical interconnectedness, we have to be able to ask questions that enable us to move in the direction that we ultimately should go to become our highest and best selves and to optimize society. So one question is, how can we understand the meaning of sacredness against the backdrop of social injustice and violence? Because social injustice and violence are very much with us. And even though we're trying to overcome them, we can't get carried away into the belief that some people are just not human, because that belief is the very thing that has generated a lot of the polarity that we experience in society today. A second question is, how can we take action to end social injustice and violence while remaining cognizant of sacredness? How can we hold the sacredness of people who trouble us deeply, while at the same time working to end social injustice and violence and not forgetting the connection that we have? I'll say more about this as time goes on. I love this quote from Sister Chan Kong, who is a Buddhist nun who's worked closely with Thich Nhat Hanh. She wrote this in her book, Learning True Love. She said, "Men are not our enemies. Our only enemies are the misunderstanding, hatred, jealousy, and ignorance that lead to such acts of violence." This is one way out of the conundrum that I presented on the previous slide. It's understanding that it's really the attributes that people may inculcate and display that we are actually opposed to, or that we actually want to transform. It's not human beings themselves that are our enemies, but rather it is those negative attributes that we know are not best for the human race. Now I want to turn our attention to human relationships, which was the second thing on that list of 4 views that I wanted us to consider when we think about the invitational framework. And here are the notions that I'd like to advance. First is that human beings are fundamentally interconnected. Second, we cannot and do not exist independently of one another. Third, our interconnections are physical, emotional, intellectual, spiritual, social, and environmental. In other words, they are multidimensional, not just on one level or layer. And fourth, that human beings are designed to grow and develop towards greater connection, not towards greater separateness. Now, all of these ideas have obviously been advanced by other people, but I want us to look at them collectively as a whole and understand them as part and parcel of a single framework. There are several other actual representations of this idea. For example, in African cultures, you can find the concept of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a Swahili word, and it refers to the notion that I am because we are, and because we are, I am. It isn't, this sort of idea of the integral relationship between individuals and the collectives in which they exist. A similar idea is expressed in Buddhism, the concept of interbeing, the idea that we cannot just be by ourselves alone, we can only interbe with everyone and everything else. Or to quote Thich Nhat Hanh, we inter-are. Here are some things that Baha'u'llah and other figures from the Baha'i faith say about it. Baha'u'llah says, "Ye are the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one branch. Deal ye with one another with the utmost love and harmony, with friendliness and fellowship." Abdu'l-Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah and the center of the covenant in the Baha'i faith, said this: "Ye are all the waves of one sea, the rays of one sun, the flowers of one garden, the lions of one thicket, the birds of one meadow, and the fragrant blossoms of one rose garden. Wherefore ye are even as a single soul." It gets back to that interconnectedness of all human beings, how there is a common spiritual fabric that makes us of one kind and links us together. The Bab, who was the prophet herald of the Baha'i faith, wrote this: "Regard ye not others save as ye regard your own selves, that no feeling of aversion may prevail amongst you. It behooveth you all to be one indivisible people." Same idea, expressed three different ways by the three central figures of the Baha'i faith. So, as we are trying to convey here, connection is an ontological condition, not something waiting to be created. The problem isn't that human beings are disconnected and we need to create connection. We actually are already connected, and we need to notice, understand, and become conscious of that connection. Therefore, oneness is also an ontological condition awaiting our consciousness of it. Becoming conscious of it is the task of these times. So we are so fraught now for the very reason that we are on the brink of discovering our oneness and putting it into action to move the world in the direction that we would all like it to go. Invitational thinking requires us to think of all people as one common family, linked by indissoluble bonds of interconnection. Indissoluble bonds means these are bonds that cannot be broken. We all know that when we have family members, even if we get in a fight, even if we don't like them, we're still connected by blood. The same is true of the entire human race in this point of view. Humanity is a single, indivisible body. And when any part of that body is unwell, the whole body is unwell, and the body as a whole must heal. When we think of our own physical bodies, we understand that if something in us is unwell, we healed that thing. We don't say, "You're not part of me." We don't take that part of the body, cut it off, cut it out, and give it away. We heal the body. So the same is true with the human race. We heal the human race. We look at ourselves and we say, where are we suffering? Where do we have things that we need to change, heal, alter? If there's injustice in the world, that's a form of illness within the body politic of humanity. The invitational perspective reminds us to remember this and to invite others to remember this. So these times, crazy as it seems, are urging us to remember this and to act upon it. I love this quote from Louisa Tisch, who is one of the scholars who have informed my work on womanism. She writes a lot about African spirituality, and one of the things she said was this: "And so if I'm stumbling along with my day-to-day guidance, sometimes I encounter what I call spiritual entrapment. No matter which direction I turn, I can't run, so I'm trapped. And because I'm trapped, I now have to learn how to fly. The only way I can get out of this situation is to do something completely different and rise up and fly away. Guidance by obstruction. I love that quote because it makes me think of these times we're in. You know, people talk about how crazy they feel about all the polarization, how it feels like there's no way out, how it feels like there's political gridlock, and how people are so entrenched in their positions and there's no way to go. So based on this guidance by instruction, this brick wall that's around us is telling us what we've been doing isn't the solution, that there's something else that we need to do. Now, let me talk about this also from a Baha'i perspective. We have to be aware of two simultaneous forces going on side by side, namely the forces of disintegration and the forces of integration. The forces of disintegration are allowing everything that stands in the way of unity, justice, peace, and human well-being to collapse and implode. Social structures and systems that don't work are undergoing self-destruction. This is a painful process because these systems are deeply entrenched and familiar. Even those of us most committed to justice and change are often still imbricated in these systems. On the other hand, the forces of integration are building the new systems and the new patterns of life that produce and sustain unity, justice, peace, human well-being, spiritual and material prosperity, and ecological sustainability. As a result, we are undergoing an organic change in the very structure of society. So now let me turn to the third item in the list, society, and let me advance these notions. First, the ultimate inclusion is all humankind. The ultimate invitation is to everyone. Oneness is the endpoint of the journey that humanity has been on for thousands of years. Once we consciously embrace our oneness, another journey will begin. So this is how I view the current moment that's going on. The idea is that humanity has been growing and growing into larger and larger collectives, starting with small collectives like families and tribes and villages, on up to cities and city-states and nations, and then groups of nations. The only thing next is the entire globe. It's all humanity. And this is also spoken of in the Baha'i writings. So we're at this precipice. This thing has to happen next because the old system of being divided doesn't work anymore. And once we consciously, as all humanity, recognize and embrace this, we will be able to begin another journey that will take humanity to points unknown that will be far beyond what we can even imagine now. And as a Baha'i, I believe that Baha'u'llah came to actually prepare us for this journey and give us the first set of things that we need for all of humanity to embark on the journey of oneness and what can come from that. I also like to compare this idea about oneness with an idea that shows up in many African cosmological accounts, this notion of an ever expanding community and circles of community and inclusion. At the center of these circles is the individual or dyad. That dyad could be a husband and wife, it could be a mother and child, it could be twins, it could be any number of dyads. But these dyads are then included in increasingly expanding levels: family, tribe, nation, all humanity, and ultimately the entire cosmos. So it's inclusive of the environment, it's also inclusive of the universe, and it's also inclusive of the spiritual realm. Baha'u'llah says the earth is but one country and mankind its citizens. Many people have heard this quote from Baha'u'llah. It's a notion that this is really the world that we're headed towards, this idea of a planet in which everyone recognizes that we are all of a kind. That's what's next. He also says, glory not in love for your country, but in love for all mankind. It doesn't mean that we won't have countries. It doesn't mean that people won't love their countries, but love of all humanity in this day and age can supersede all other lesser affiliations. The Universal House of Justice, which is the highest governing body of the worldwide Baha'i community, wrote this in one of its letters to the Baha'is of the world. Baha'u'llah's revelation is vast. It calls for profound change, not only at the level of the individual, but also in the structure of society. Is not the object of every revelation, he himself, meaning Baha'u'llah, proclaims, to effect a transformation in the whole character of mankind? A transformation that shall manifest itself both outwardly and inwardly, that shall affect both its inner life and external conditions. So our understanding is that a profound transformation is taking place now and that we are all a part of it, wittingly or unwittingly. So what are some things that we have to gain from an invitational perspective? For one thing, we have to gain more approaches to social change that are based on interconnectedness and reciprocity rather than top-down or bottom-up interactional flows. We also have to gain more consensus building, more peace building, and reduction of violence. We have the ability to move away from dependency models due to people being more aware of themselves as protagonists. In other words, recognizing that we all have a role to play in this change, going in a good direction and feeling empowered to participate. We will also see better connection between the local and the global, because local communities are still very important in where we live our daily lives, but our local communities are all interconnected with everybody else's local communities, and it ultimately forms the global whole. And we'll also have more equality, equity, and justice of all kinds. So overall, what we stand to gain is genuine, structural, systemic change, and PS, it's sustainable. More things that we have to gain from an invitational perspective. There'll be more emphasis on human and ecological well-being. We'll have better data because more minds will be contributing to the data that we have. We'll have more attention to social and emotional factors in human problem solving. We'll have more methodologies of care and healing, more holistic approaches in general, and spirituality added to public discourse in liberating ways. So ultimately, we gain a new pattern of life. So now I turn to the fourth thing in the list of things that I said are required to really understand the invitational framework or perspective, and that is the nature and purpose of life. And I just, rather than advancing propositions, I advance some questions that I'm going to answer with some quotes. What is life? What is the purpose of life? What is our ultimate purpose? And what is our purpose right now? Baha'u'llah says, all men have been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. He also says, O people of God, be not occupied with yourselves. Be intent on the betterment of the world and the training of nations. He also says, be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age you live in and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements. And he also says, soon will the present day order be rolled up and a new one spread out in its stead. So across these writings, you see an emphasis on moving from a focus on individuals to moving to a focus on larger collectives, on all humanity. You see the indication of being in a pivotal moment when things are changing, when the nature of human society is undergoing a major transformation. And you see the indication that we are, as human beings, enabled to advance our own civilization and to contribute to the betterment of life for all people. Shoghi Effendi, who was the guardian of the Baha'i faith, the grandson of Abdul Baha and the great-grandson of Baha'u'llah, was cited in a letter by Ruhiya Khanum, his wife, as saying, the object of life to a Baha'i is to promote the oneness of mankind. This was specifically in response to the notion of our purpose right now. We're at the moment of transition when humanity is growing into the conscious awareness of the oneness of humankind, and we understand our role in advancing the notion that we are a globally interconnected society and that the highest and best outcomes for all of us will come from this realization. So now I want to shift gears into a different segment of tonight's presentation, and that is putting the invitational perspective into practice. So I want to offer some exercises and some thought experiments. I love this graphic, even though I know it's a little bit blurry. And I just say, do you ever feel this way? I love humanity. Let's figure this stuff out together. I think that that point of view is reflective of an invitational perspective. Things are complicated, they're scary, they're hard, but if we really do love each other, then we just commit to figuring it out together. So I return to the questions that I asked earlier. How do we build bridges with people who are different? How do we make common cause with our so-called enemies? How do we move forward despite conflict or differing opinions? How do we work with people of different capacities or temperaments? How do we work through fear or dislike of difference? How do we overcome anxiety about taking initiative? How do we keep a tenuous connection going so that it gets stronger? And how do we make social change authentic and sustainable? These are the kinds of questions that we're concerned about in terms of applying the invitational framework. So the first topic that I want to use as a window into this perspective is racial justice. And often in the Baha'i faith, we refer to it as the most vital and challenging issue. This comes from a quote in one of Shoghi Effendi's books, The Advent of Divine Justice. It was written in 1938. And what he wrote was, as to racial prejudice, the corrosion of which for well nigh a century has bitten into the fiber and attacked the whole social structure of American society, it should be regarded as constituting the most vital and challenging issue confronting the Baha'i community at the present stage of its evolution. Now, if you are just learning about the Baha'i faith for the first time, you might not be aware that racial justice, racial harmony, racial unity, racial amity are among the most important, amongst the most important aspects of the Baha'i faith. They're important things that we focus on. They're some of our highest aspirations. We recognize that racism is one of the most toxic problems in world society, not just today, but has been for several centuries. And overcoming it has been one of the important features of the Baha'i revelation. So I want to start, when we think about an invitational approach to racial justice, I want to start with a story. And this story is courtesy of the National Center for Race Amity, that focuses a lot on talking about what they call America's other tradition, or the tradition of racial amity. And one of the things that they do is they focus on people who overcame great odds of division in the larger society to form friendships. And one of the stories that I've always loved is the story of Zernona Clayton and Calvin Craig. In the 1960s, civil rights worker Zernona Clayton befriended KKK Grand Dragon Calvin Craig, and using their shared Baptist faith for leverage, she persuaded him to leave and denounce the Klan in favor of racial amity. It was an uneven journey, but resulted in bold change. The National Center for Race Amity often talks about this story, and there's actually been a play written about it, Zernona and the Grand Dragon. For many people, it's unthinkable. Why would a Black woman befriend a man who is ostensibly out to kill her and people who are similar to her? But based on her faith in God and her trust in humanity, she was able to find it within herself to have no fear. And through a shared workplace experience that they had, you see the Model Cities Initiative there in the background, which is where they met. She was bold, she was courageous, and she said, let me see if I can transform this heart. And through friendship and finding something that they shared and loved in common, she was able to do that. A second story comes from a book that's one of my favorite books, Left to Tell, Discovering God Amidst the Rwandan Holocaust by Immaculée Ilibagiza. She is famous for having been confined to a small 3-foot by 4-foot bathroom with 6 other women during the Rwandan genocide, only to emerge after 100 days to find her entire family slaughtered. But over the course of her life, and in a number of anecdotes that are relayed in the book, she found forgiveness through her Christian faith, and she became a spokesperson for peace. She came out of that experience, even after some very heavy and tearful soul searching and some confrontation with the killers of her family, that to reproduce that violence was not going to heal the world. She recognized in herself that if she went with her desire for vengeance, that she would only reproduce another genocide later. And she wanted to be the end of it with herself. So she found a path to radical forgiveness. It's a story worth reading if you wonder how people can make these amazing kinds of transformations. When I thought about the most challenging issue, that is the eradication of racial prejudice and racial injustice in North America, I put it through the lens of both the oppositional perspective and the invitational perspective, and these are my reflections. From an oppositional perspective, there's a tendency to say there's a bar we must reach. There might be, something that's an understanding about what racial justice looks like. You tell everyone to move towards the goal. You accept the people who make it and you reject the people who don't. And you complain that progress seems so elusive despite efforts, and then you start over again. Obviously, all methods are needed, and obviously all methods contribute. But there is also a point at which, when we draw a line in the sand and say, these people have made it and these people aren't, these people are worthy, these people are not, we begin to reproduce the polarization again. We begin to reproduce hierarchies. I think, for example, about the very vigorous conversations going on around privilege, around those kinds of things in the wider society today, and how many people are making efforts to grow, but people are starting from such different places. And when people are encouraged and supported to grow wherever they begin, then they advance to somewhere beyond where they started. Whereas when people are cut down or given harsh feedback, they often retreat out of fear and fail to continue to advance. It's not to say that we shouldn't hold ourselves and each other accountable, because candid accountability in the context of connection is extremely valuable and in fact essential to growth. But we have to figure out, where is that line between candid accountability within the context of connection versus harsh feedback that shuts people down. That line is something that each person has to determine in their situation, but it's important to think about it. When we talk about the most challenging issue from an invitational perspective, this is what I see. There's this idea of identifying a common direction, not just a bar to cross, but a common direction for people to move. And then having everyone identify where their starting point is, to do that self-reflection, to understand that we're all coming from different places, but knowing where we're starting from and knowing what might be the next milestone for us. And then everybody moving forward together in that common direction, from wherever they're starting to whatever their next goal point is, and keeping going and continuing to support and accept that people are coming from different places and moving at different speeds as we take this journey together. And as we go, we celebrate everyone's progress. We offer positive rewards and reinforcement for everyone's growth, regardless of their starting point. That inspires people to keep moving. And it also keeps us in connection and in communication in ways that enable our learning from each other and our development of new aspirations for our own growth. All right, so now I want to talk about this notion of dispositions, and that is, what does it require of us dispositionally to do this social change work within the invitational perspective? This Shoghi Effendi, in his work on the most challenging issue, tells us that the work of dismantling racial prejudice and racism requires the following things: ceaseless exertions, sacrifices, care and vigilance, moral courage and fortitude, tact and sympathy, genuine love, extreme patience, true humility, consummate tact, sound initiative, mature wisdom, deliberate, persistent, prayerful effort, understanding, amity, and sustained cooperation. Now, I want us to think about these dispositions in the context of the invitational perspective and approach and the role that they play. If you're inviting someone to do something with you, then you have to have dispositions that sustain a connection between you and that person. We've all been in situations where someone that we're interacting with sustains that connection with us, and situations where someone breaks that connection because their behavior pushes us away or shuts us down. So what Shoghi Effendi is asking us to do is reflect on those dispositions that keep us connected, keep us focused on one another's nobility, and keep us focused on our virtues and our high destiny. Another set of dispositions that he also writes about are obedience to God, sincerity, humility, enthusiasm, integrity, courtesy, moderation, rectitude of conduct, purity of motive, detachment from personal views, respect for human dignity and nobility, and maintaining the long view. We know that the most profound forms of social change are not achieved in a few weeks, a few months, a few years, sometimes not even in a few lifetimes. Sometimes they take multiple generations, sometimes they take hundreds of years. We all have a role to play in moving things forward in that common direction. So maintaining the long view and coming with these other dispositions from the invitational perspective is all quite important. And in some respects, these are very different attributes than what we typically associate with effective activism. Sometimes they involve something that feels like self-suppression or feels like not using our voices. But I think the argument is that there are many dimensions of ourselves that we need to bring to the social change process, and that the more we can be showing up in ways that maintain connection, and in ways that are not ego-based, but are based on the well-being of the collective. Of course, our own is part of that, but thinking broadly is really important. Here's another story that I like to share. It comes from Louis Venter's book, No Jim Crow Church, which is a history of the origins of South Carolina's Baha'i community. It's a fascinating read because it talks about how during the early days of the Baha'i faith in South Carolina, which is really the early part of the 20th century, the Baha'is had to figure out how to realize the Baha'i faith's vision of interracial unity without engaging in conflict or breaking any laws. The reason for that is because Baha'u'llah expressly forbids conflict in his Book of Laws, and Baha'is also are required not to break laws of their governments. So, stewarded by Louis G. Gregory, who was an early Black Baha'i from Charleston, South Carolina, the Baha'is worked through such issues as racial prejudice within their ranks, because some people did join the faith, weren't aware of, racial unity and elimination of prejudice as one of the values of the Baha'i faith. So they had to learn that, how to hold interracial gatherings without breaking the law under segregation. They had to know the law well. They had to find spaces that were not illegal to have interracial gatherings. They had to enter buildings in ways that didn't break the law and all sorts of things, but they did do it and actually build a thriving interracial Baha'i community. They had to address social class issues associated with race, and they had to figure out how to gain legal recognition for Baha'i marriages, including interracial marriages, of which there were many. The stance of Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi regarding racial integration and eradicating race prejudice was unwavering, even though they were aware of the laws in the United States. And their nurturant guidance shaped South Carolina's nascent Baha'i community over many decades, resulting in the Baha'i faith becoming the second most common religious affiliation in South Carolina after Christianity. And for many people who didn't buy into or agree with segregation as a way of life, the Baha'i faith and the Baha'i community was a haven for another point of view. It reflected an invitational community. So this is a quote from Baha'u'llah that I love. The light of men is justice. This is the logo from a Facebook group, Baha'is Exploring Social Justice. And I just wanted to share it because I think it relates to what we're talking about. But now let's turn to a second issue, and that's the issue of addressing COVID-19. It's obviously a global worldwide pandemic, which has affected us not only in medical ways and health-wise, but it has really exacerbated many of the inequalities and injustices that already exist in the world, including those related to race, class, immigration status, level of wealth or economic insecurity. All of these things have been exacerbated by the global pandemic. And I'm going to put forth a series of questions, so we're sort of veering into thought experiment territory. But after thinking about these questions from the perspective of COVID, we also have the opportunity to think about these questions from the perspective of other big issues that we care deeply about. I like to just start with this quote that I think is really beautiful. We don't have to agree on anything to be kind to one another. And kindness is the opposite of violence. So more kindness is a form of systemic change. It affects the energy environment in which all other aspects of society evolve and form. So let's imagine using an invitational framework to reimagine a COVID-free world. If we put human well-being front and center as the top concern or objective, what kind of reframe do we get immediately? So imagine, in the case of a global pandemic, if we put human well-being front and center, how would our processes be different? What would we do differently? What is the root cause of this situation, in this case, the pandemic? And how can we see these root causes from the perspective of all parties involved? So the root cause is a pandemic that comes from a germ, but why does that germ circulate in our world? And also, why does it affect different groups of people differently? What are the root causes that we need to hone in on? And what is the feeling dimension, not just the intellectual or ideological dimension of the situation? What emotional work needs to be done here? What kinds of feelings, for example, do we hold about our fellow human beings that allow us to witness some people suffering more than others, some groups having access to the needed resources for health and well-being, and others not having access to those resources, etc. Another set of questions is these: what are some healing and restorative actions that would make a difference in moving all parties towards well-being simultaneously? If we think about the need to move everyone in the direction of health and wellness, what would we do differently than we do currently, which results in wellness for some people, but not for others? What is the outer work that needs to be done, meaning the work out in society? What is the inner work that needs to be done, meaning the work that we need to do within ourselves? What are the barriers within myself that are holding the undesirable situation in place? Because it goes back to that idea that as human beings, we're all one body. If there's some unwellness in part of the body, it affects all of us, and all of us are somehow sustaining it. So what are the barriers within ourselves that are holding the undesirable situation in place? And what is needed to make me change? And how can understanding this help me support change in others? Because we, sometimes we see in activism people, calls for people to change, but we have to change ourselves. We have to gain wisdom from what it took to change ourselves. And then we have to use that to empathize and help support other people in the changes that we all need to make society function more effectively. Also, what needs to be changed at the everyday level? That's the level at which we circulate in our own homes, our own neighborhoods, the things we do every day, like go to work and school and go to the grocery store, etc. What needs to be changed at the interpersonal level, which is the level at which we interact with other people one-on-one or in groups? What needs to be changed at the institutional or structural level? Those are the institutions governing society, the organizations and the things that carry out the policies and procedures governing society. And what needs to be changed at the environment or physical level? That could be the physical environment of our homes and our businesses and our schools and the places where we worship, or any place that we go. It also could be the environment in terms of the plants, the trees, the animals, the weather, all those things. We are interconnected with all of that, and we need to think about what do we need to change about that relationship, or about the kinds of structures that we're building that would ultimately influence whatever problem that we're trying to solve. And how can the spiritual level be brought in? We have a very materialistic viewpoint and a very materialistic approach in the world today. But one of the things that the invitational perspective encourages us to do is think about how the spiritual realm can be brought in to assist us to solve material problems. Furthermore, what am I able to do from my current location to influence this situation? Where can I show up? All of us can show up somewhere. Sometimes we get caught in this trap of waiting for somebody else to solve the problem, whether we're waiting for government or waiting for businesses or waiting for somebody else in our community or somebody who we think has the power. This is the idea that all of us show up somewhere. All of us have influence somewhere. What can we do from where we are to change? Because if all of us do this, it leads to big changes. Who am I able to influence from my current location? How can I invite others to change, or invite them to this better situation or world that I'm envisioning? Better yet, if we can envision it together. Who are my collaborators, and what kinds of service can we engage in together? How can I transform oppositional energies into invitational energies when they creep in? Because it's easy to slip into an oppositional framework when we feel stressed, when we're having a hard time making things move. But when we feel that creep, how do we shift it back to an invitational frame of mind or an invitational heart space? And last but not least, what kinds of self-care are needed to keep all this going? We know that when we're engaged in change work, we're susceptible to burnout. It's hard, it's not easy, it's draining. And if we don't take care of ourselves, we can't wake up the next day to do it again. So we have to ask questions about the practices that sustain us. All right, so having gone through this set of questions and having us think about COVID-19 and the pandemic and its solution while we were going through them, what if we use these same kinds of questions to analyze other big issues? And I ask you as the audience, what kinds of issues can you imagine putting through this filter? You can maybe put something in the chat or the Q&A about the issues that you could imagine rethinking through this filter of the invitational framework. So the last experiment here is just this exercise. I used to do this with my classes when I taught. We would do this thing called working backwards from the solution. And it had 3 steps. The first was to state clearly the problem that you'd like to solve. then to clearly and in detail envision the ideal solution, and then to plot together the steps that will take it from point A to point B. All right, because the idea is that if we understand where we are and where we need to go, and we think carefully about all the transformations that are needed along the way, we can map out a very planful way of getting to our ideal endpoint. And each of these steps is an opportunity to invite others. I'm not suggesting a solipsistic exercise in which we impose our view on the world, but rather an invitation to think together with others and use our hearts to attract and find people who have our same concerns and similar passions about making change. All right, this is an example that I like to share from one of my favorite books, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And in that book, he offers the principle of ahimsa, which means nonviolence. A lot of people have heard it because a lot of social movements have pulled on nonviolence. This is the Sanskrit writing of ahimsa. When we are firmly established in nonviolence, all beings around us cease to feel hostility. This quote goes with the previous thought experiment because it is an if-then statement. It is a statement that has an understanding about where we are and where we want to go, and a process by which we can undertake transformation. So the understanding is that when we ourselves personally are firmly established in nonviolence, meaning that we've worked on nonviolence within ourselves, then all beings around us cease to feel hostility, that is outwardly in the outer world, because the energies that we are bringing no longer sustain hostility and conflict. So it shows the importance of doing the inner work and the outer work simultaneously, and it shows that there's a relationship between those things. This quote from Baha'u'llah also gives us food for thought, and that is, true life is not the life of the flesh, but the life of the spirit. Baha'u'llah brings an understanding which other prophets and messengers from God have also talked about, which is that life is at the very least two-dimensional. There's this material world that we live in now in our bodies, and there's another spiritual world, a world that's invisible to us now, but which exists and which is interconnected or interpenetrated with our material life. And that there's something that is more vital or something that is really the source of our life in that life of the spirit. And so there's encouragement here to connect with that, to explore that, to understand that the life that we're living today, even by all appearances material, is suffused by something spiritual, and that we can draw on that to make the changes that we want to make to sustain ourselves and to sustain each other. So here's my summary. The invitational framework is both a perspective and a methodology. It's aligned with the realization of the oneness of humanity, rooted in cultural and spiritual perspectives and practices that elevate interconnectedness. It visualizes humanity as one family and focuses on realizing ever more expansive circles of inclusion. It is a begin where you are way of advancing humanity's well-being. Invitation is an act of love and often of courage. It begins a chain reaction that passes love, care, and connection from one person to the next, and from individuals to communities and institutions. In so doing, it changes systems, creating a new pattern of life in line with our highest aspirations. And I'll just end with this quote from Baha'u'llah's Hidden Words. Know ye not, why we created you all from the same dust, that no one should exalt himself over the other. Ponder at all times in your hearts how you were created. Since we have created you all from one same substance, it is incumbent on you to be even as one soul, to walk with the same feet, eat with the same mouth, and dwell in the same land, that from your inmost being, by your deeds and actions, the signs of oneness and the essence of detachment may be made manifest. So I will leave you with that, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I was just thinking about all of the people that I'm wanting to contact right now to say, like, hey, can you come watch us right now with me, please, so we can talk about this and get to work. We have a few questions. One thing I was thinking, I was like, oh wow, You know, the Universal House of Justice, the world governing body of the Baha'is of the world, talks about how, you know, there's a track that the Baha'i world is on right now, working for the oneness of humanity, using what's called the Institute process, gaining these new capacities and perspectives, and they're saying this is the path to race unity.
Mhm.
They're not two separate paths. And it occurred to me while you were talking that working for the realization at the level of consciousness of what is already true of the oneness of humanity is almost like, it makes me think of like going to a Chinese medical doctor and getting acupuncture to balance the system rather than addressing symptoms of the imbalance. You're directly addressing the balance or the unity of the body.
Right. Yeah. And I think that that what you just described is really encapsulated in this phrase that has appeared more and more, particularly in messages from the Universal House of Justice, this notion of a new pattern of life, that we have an old pattern of life that doesn't work, you know, and we understand that a pattern is many different things, many different parts, but that we have to move towards this new pattern of life. We have to create it. You know, the seeds are there because the seed is the existing oneness of humanity that we have to become conscious of, and that we have to embrace, and then we have to bootstrap from into this new way of life, this new pattern of life, this new world structure, system, whatever. You know, there are different ways to talk about it, but the bottom line is that it's going to unlock something very powerful and vivifying for humanity. So it's like, if we can just make it to the finish line and cross over without killing ourselves, you know, it'll be great afterwards. And so we're in these very precarious times when I honestly think it's thrilling to be alive. But the more we identify with that process and dig deeply in ourselves and in prayer to understand our role in it, then the more we can accelerate it and ensure the safety of humankind. We can help everybody cross, you know? So it's, it's a point of view.
Yeah, it's an extremely holistic and helpful point of view. So we have a few questions here. One is, how do we maintain this invitational framework while also understanding when we're not safe and keeping ourselves safe from violence or oppression?
Right. That's a great question. And it's an answerable question because there are so many of us doing the work at once. This perspective does not ask us to cross the line into threatening our own lives or being in an unsafe situation, because for every person that's behaving in a way that's unsafe to somebody, there's somebody else who can interact with them in the needed way. You know, so we have to rely on each other. We have to communicate with each other, and we all have to figure out, who can I interact with to advance this? You know, we can think about different groups of people or different types of individuals having different capacities, different talents, different avenues by which they can influence others. And part of what we have to do is notice who needs what, where can we step in and be helpful? You know, so I mean, I could give examples, but I'm hoping that people can sort of imagine examples of how we can interact with certain people that others can't, and that it's our responsibility to step in and intervene wherever we're capable on behalf of people who can't interact with that person in the same way we can.
Yeah, that makes so much sense.
It could be a person, it could be an institution, it could be a system. It's not just individual to individual. It also involves systems. Certain groups can interact with other groups. Certain people have power within institutions to make things change how institutions do what they do. You know, all of those avenues are part of the process. We do this together.
Yeah, so it begs the question, where is our sphere of influence? And aware of that, and where we step in.
Right.
And being conscious and being proactive.
Right. And asking the question of what is my sphere of influence is very, very important, because the way society tends to kind of set up the discourse now, the idea is some people have power and some people don't. The ones who have power, they need to change. The ones who don't have power need to wait for those guys to change, you know, but This view is different. This view is everybody has power somewhere, and everybody shows up somewhere, and everybody has influence somewhere. So we need to recognize where that is, and we need to do it within the sphere that we are able to do it. Sometimes that thought process requires us understanding that we have more influence than we think we do. Sometimes it's just a matter of us noticing where we show up and what the opportunities are there rather than not thinking about it.
Right. Is an invitational approach possible when working with people who do not themselves accept or believe in the premise of an invitational perspective? I believe it is, but I find it hard to see how it's possible when other people engage in the work with a confrontational approach.
Mm-hmm. That is also a great question. And the trick to that is that the questioner used the word believe in believe in an invitational perspective. This, you don't have to believe it. This is heart work. So you can take somebody with a confrontational approach and you can learn how to approach them through the heart. You often do that not by talking about ideas, but engaging around things that you already have commonality with or things that influence how people feel. So for example, finding something that you're both interested in or you both love or complimenting, for anything that can create a heart connection is the entry point. You don't get to it by we just have a checklist of shared beliefs. You get to it through, wow, I feel good around this person feels good around me. I'm contributing to them feeling good around me feeling good around them. We're connecting, we're finding points of connection, even if it's just hi, hello to warm it up. I mean, we influence how each other feels, and how each other feels influences how we connect or don't connect. It's not just about beliefs, it's also about feelings. That's why I emphasize that over and over and over.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that. As a deeply feeling person, I often feel like we're not incorporating that part of our reality, which is a huge part of our reality.
Right.
So I deeply
We
appreciate
have to wonder, how do people who are so different sometimes form friendships? Think about, for example, recently when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and they talked so much about her deep friendship with Antonin Scalia, night and day on beliefs, but how were they best friends who went to the opera together, who had dinner together, whose kids play together, whatever, people learn how to connect through the heart and through their lives in ways that may or may not relate to having a checklist of shared beliefs. But once you form the connection, you can discuss the beliefs across the transom of connection, and that's very important.
Yeah, I really appreciated that phrase you said earlier, candid accountability within the context of connection.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, then it's possible.
Mm-hmm. It is, and otherwise it's not.
Right. So interesting. It's like we have to get in touch with our shared humanity first.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah, history has taught us you can't beat people into changing their beliefs. You can only sort of love them into it.
Right. First, you would think that we would have gotten that by now, but it's hard. I think it's an ego thing still. We want to force change.
Yeah, and we're also sometimes overly intellectual.
Mm-hmm. I love that a professor is saying that. So another person is asking, so they're curious about your use of the word politics. I'm not sure if you want to answer that question, feel free. If you don't want to answer that question, that's perfectly fine.
Politics is sort of an academic word, the way I'm using it here. It's sort of a word that social theorists use to talk about power structures. So it sort of just means the outlay of power or a framework for understanding how power is organized.
Okay, thank you. All right, we've got just a couple here. How will the inclusion of women and minorities change the functioning of groups, governments, and the world? When do you envision the organic change in society occurring in a substantial way? How can we best contribute to this change?
Okay, people from diverse backgrounds, as I sort of alluded, will change things because different minds are bringing different data, different perspectives. People aren't just different colored bodies or different shaped bodies. They are people with different standpoints, different worldviews, different cultures, different life experiences. The more different kinds of people are involved, the richer the data, the richer our understandings, And when we learn to not automatically hierarchize people's thinking by thinking, this is an intelligent person, I'll listen to them. This one's not intelligent, I won't listen to them. This one comes from a background that makes no sense to me, therefore I won't listen to them, or whatever. We have to get rid of all that kind of stuff and come in on a footing of existential equality combined with curiosity, so that we can really hear, listen to, and learn from other people. It is absolutely essential that we become inclusive of people across all their forms of difference, and that we come into those relationships understanding that we're all spiritual noble beings, no matter how we present on the outside, and that all of our differences reflect some aspect of creation that only those people bring. So it's, we have to do it. It's going to be good. And now, what were the other parts of the question about? When do I think? Remember.
When do you envision the organic change in society occurring in a substantial way?
That's an interesting calculus, because in my mind, there is a ticking clock of climate change and mass extinction. At the same time, there is an accelerating growing of human consciousness. And at some point, as a mathematician might say, those lines are going to cross, and where they're going to cross, I don't know exactly. Do I really expect it to be in my lifetime? Probably not. Is it going to be in the lifetime of my kids? Maybe. Only because the climate change clock is ticking so fast. But I also know that Baha'u'llah said in some comments to some Zoroastrians that his revelation is starting a 500,000 year cycle for humanity. And when I think about how long 500,000 years is, that's about as long as Homo sapiens has been a species. So if we think about how much change we've made over that time, I like to imagine how much change we can make over the next 500,000 years. And it's probably virtually unimaginable to any of us alive today, but who's ever left after those lines cross is going to fulfill that. And that's exciting to me. I like thinking that I'm part of that,
Yeah, absolutely. At one point you talked about, once we reach this kind of critical mass of the consciousness of the oneness of humanity, then a new journey begins.
New journey begins.
Yeah.
It's going to click in and we're off and running,
Right.
And it's going to be a beautiful day. It could be called, when I look at the things that we're being forced to learn by the coronavirus pandemic or by climate change or, these sorts of things, we have a pretty steep learning curve right now. We pretty much have to get it or we're going to be in trouble. So I think we're getting close.
Yeah. So the last part of her question was, how can we best contribute to this change?
I think the best way that we can contribute to this change is first by simply recognizing the spiritual nature of ourselves and all humanity and shifting our focus to the nobility of all people and always pulling ourselves back to that, even when we slip away, because it's so easy to slip away. And thinking about our sphere of influence, where can we have impact, and think about every choice and every action every day as contributing towards that place or not towards that place, and working as hard as we can to always be making the choices that lead towards that place.
This person says, what an awesome framework. I feel like you've talked around this, but I'm wondering if you have any specific thought about the following. And then he says, talking about ideals doesn't necessarily produce ideals in the world. What is required to have something actually show up in the world?
It's what I talked about before. It's the heart-mind matrix. That place where feelings and thoughts cross is where the action is.
Where can we learn more about that?
Where can we learn more about that? All over the place. I think that a lot of spiritual traditions talk about it. A lot of psychological treatises talk about it. But we can also learn a lot about it from self-reflection.
Yeah.
I think that when we notice, we really just pause to notice where our feelings are, where our mind is, whether they're connected and working together or not, because that's really the information we need. We learn it most from ourselves and from observing others, but people have written about it for thousands of years. So, There's a lot of good stuff out there.
Yeah.
I learned a lot, actually, as you probably noticed from this presentation. I learned a lot from studying Buddhism. You know, I'm a Baha'i, but Buddhism is a tradition that I've actually studied a good deal. And there's some interesting ideas in Buddhist psychology that get to the heart-mind nexus, and look at it through a different lens than we often do in the sort of Western dominant worldview about human beings. And I've found it to be very instructive. I'll give you an example. One of the things I learned from Buddhism that's very valuable in social justice settings is learning non-defensiveness.
Mm.
It's very easy to feel like your ego is being attacked and then to get into reactive mode. But if you learn how to push a button for non-defensiveness, so that you go on that pathway instead of the ego react pathway, it makes a lot of things possible that aren't possible otherwise. And that's a lesson I learned from Buddhism. So there's there's a whole discourse, for example, with regard to kids now on social emotional learning, which looks at that, and how kids feeling relates to how well they learn in school and how it affects their social interactions and their moral behaviors. There's a lot, it shows up in so many places.
Here's another one. Interesting. So what they're saying is, how do we learn how to fly into a new pattern of life if we are boxed in?
That's an interesting question. I wonder in what way they mean boxed in. I think that there are a few different ways to learn it. One way is sometimes when you're forced. If your house is on fire, you have to run out. You don't have time to think. There are things inside you that help you figure out what you need to do to get out of the burning house, So getting to know ourselves more deeply and being forced in those kind of situations to learn things about ourselves that we didn't know is one way. But another way, quite on the opposite, is deep study of pathways. For example, I'm a big fan of the deep study of spirituality. There's a lot of information in the world's spiritual traditions, including the Baha'i writings, others as well, about how to sustainably change ourselves and the character of our own being, how to refine ourselves, and about how to change the world. I mean, studying deeply things that are about that and really actively trying to learn them is another way, and there are other things in between.
So this is interesting. This person says the history of the Baha'i faith, from their point of view, has examples of the central figures of the Baha'i faith using the oppositional framework and sometimes the invitational framework. Do you think we also need to be flexible about using the suitable frameworks based on the problem at hand?
I do. As I said briefly in my talk, both are useful. But when you don't have both tools in the toolbox, then there'll be one time when you need one, you don't have it. And right now, the invitational perspective is the more submerged perspective. It's the one that is perhaps emerging more. But, I'm a firm believer that we need to have multiple tools in our toolkit and know when to use each one.
And then the last question, could you say more about the ontological condition?
Ontological means something as a feature of reality. It means it's getting into the basic nature of what exists. Ontology is our understanding about reality and what exists.
So that is all we have for our questions. Someone put in the chat, the questions raised in this talk are paving our path of service. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I appreciate everyone who's come tonight. And I actually am looking forward to reading all the chat comments.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maparyan. I really hope that we can have you back and maybe even have smaller workshops potentially, where people are interacting and really grappling collectively with some of these exercises.
Well, thank you. I really enjoy all the work that I get to do with Greenacre, and I'm a big fan and admirer of Greenacre's way of being in the world. So thank you.
Oh, thanks. All right, everyone, we appreciate you being here this evening. As I mentioned in the chat, this is being recorded. and almost certainly will be up on our website probably next week at some point, if not the week after. So please check us out. We've got other recordings, including Dr. Maparyan's most recent recording here with Greenacre up on our website. If you go to stories, you'll find it under there. And again, thank you so very much. I think this was incredibly helpful for me, and I'm going to say for a lot of other people too.
Thank
Right.
you.
Take care, everyone.
Sure.
Good night.